I think what we do is really important. The Christian church has to be united, and it can't be united if it doesn't know what's going on. The range of stories we cover is universal. The approach we have is comprehensive.
We're looking to help people, with ministry, mission. We also publish positive, constructive content, which aims to help the church be a better church, and that's what we care about.
But we also look at things incredibly in depth. We take a lot of time with our stories, make sure that they're accurate, that they're very detailed, and the reader is not left asking questions at the end.
It enlightens bits of the world that don't get reported elsewhere.
I think what's really important about the Church Times is it's independent. We're not affiliated to any other organisation, so we're really free in what we can write.
If the church screws up, then we report it. If the church does something fantastic, then we report it. We deliberately don't have our own agenda.
One of my favourite things about the Church Times is our book reviews. I think it's really important because it points clergy and really interested lay people to what some of the latest theology is, academic theology, but also books about spirituality, things like prayer, and also social issues.
Subscribers can access 150 years of past issues through the Church Times' own website, which is linked to the UK Press Online site, and they can look at any of the issues since 1863 page by page.
So I really enjoy doing a cartoon for the Church Times when I've got a really strong idea and I know that it's something that the readers will enjoy.
A huge part of the service we provide the church is advertising jobs specific for clergy, but also for musicians, teachers, youth workers and so on.
The Church Times runs the Festival of Preaching, which is a chance for clergy and readers and anyone else who's interested to really explore the craft of preaching. The Festival of Faith and Literature is a literary festival with a theological slant, at which questions of faith and theology are explored. The Church Times Cricket Cup has been going since 1951. When they put on their cricket whites, the different traditions and the things that might divide them become much less significant, and it's definitely plays some role in helping forge Christian unity. The Church Times also runs the Green Awards together with the Church of England's Shrinking the Footprint campaign. It's a way to celebrate those churches that are leading the way in being good stewards of the environment.
One of the things that we do is start a dialogue between various groups in the church and really try and represent all views.
You ought to be able to read the Church Times and come out at the end of it more excited about what your Christian life is like.
The podcast was set up almost a year ago, and really the idea was to be a place where we could talk about the background of stories, how we came upon stories, provide some analysis of what's going on in the church and the wider world.
The Church Times is available on old-fashioned bits of paper. It's available on your phone, your computer, your tablet. There's an app. We make it as accessible as we possibly can. We're always looking for more subscribers, and if anybody wants to, it's terribly easy. All they have to do is go to the website, or they can even phone up.
Welcome everyone who's joined us to this Church Times webinar, The Weight of This Calling, Clergy Burnout, Wellbeing and Resilience. I'm Angela Tilby. I'm a retired priest, retired from Parish and then Cathedral Ministry, and now living in Portsmouth. Now, we come together at the most extraordinary time when perhaps the threads of love and loyalty that bind us to God and to God's people, and those particular people who care for us and whom we care for, those threads may feel as though they're overstretched and even wearing thin. Of course, it's not only us in ministry who are having this experience, health workers, teachers, many, many others who interact with human need, who have human needs, as we all do. We're all feeling perhaps ragged and exhausted. When I was continuing ministerial development advisor in the Oxford diocese, I found that there were three things which came up again and again after clergy had had their ministerial reviews. One was the need for a retreat. The next was the desire for a sabbatical. And the third, trailing the other two by some distance, I have to say, was the desire for a period of study. And I came then to recognise that there are particular ways in which clergy and other ministers can experience depletion, a running out of personal resources, which can question their sense of vocation, even their faith, and cause an immense amount of sadness, distress and illness. So there are questions for us. How do we survive? And not only survive, how do we flourish somehow? How do we find hope and strength? How can the institutions help, from diocese to parish level, deaneries, other parts of the institution? What can we do to help one another? Is there guidance on the way? And just to inspire you to read and reflect more, I can pass on to you the good news that the Church Times Bookshop is offering free postage and packaging on online orders for UK customers. We're going to hear contributions from a number of people with experience and expertise in ministry, and it's very real pressures. Each contribution will be 7 or so minutes long, and then there'll be a chance for perhaps a brief reflection and perhaps the odd question or comment afterwards. Then after those contributions, there'll be a break, time to refill your mug or glass, and then a full question and answer session for the second half. So just first of all, to go through our contributors. First is Paul Swann, a priest experienced in spiritual direction and the author of Sustaining Leadership. Then Justine Allain-Chapman, Archdeacon of Boston, author of The Resilient Disciple. Simon Butler follows. He's the Vicar of St Mary's Battersea and Chair of the General Synod's House of Clergy. Then Bishop John Inge, Bishop of Worcester. And finally, Liz Graveling, Research Officer for the Church's Ministry Division and author of How Clergy Thrive. Well, Paul Swann is going to go first, and he's recorded his contribution, which we start with now.
Hello, I'm Paul Swann, and I want to share a couple of hard-learned principles for sustaining ministry with you this afternoon. I've learnt these mainly through the experience of hitting the buffers and crashing out of full-time ministry a while back. As the title of this webinar declares, ministry is weighty. Sometimes life is too. Pretty much everything I now share is fruit born from these desert years. And it is fruit I'm needing to return to myself at present, as my ill health has returned again. I would love to be taking part today, both live and interactively, but I know that this pre-recorded message is the only option for my health and welfare, and I'm learning to listen to that voice. Perhaps that's my first and loudest point. I'm calling it priorities. I rejoice that clergy well-being is on the agenda, but we know that having something on the agenda doesn't make it a surefire thing. Unintentionally or otherwise, items slip down agendas, get carried forward, get lost under AOB, and then quietly disappear. So even as we welcome this topic to the national agenda, let's not think that that means it's anybody's priority but your own. Even when they are genuinely pastoral, those above you in the chain of command will have myriad other priorities vying for their attention. And even the most caring of congregations still have certain expectations of their clergy, which can themselves be quite weighty. And colleagues, well, in the best case scenarios, they are supportive. But many of us have experienced the weight of these dangerous twins, comparison and competitiveness. So I've learned that for welfare to happen, it must begin with self-care. And for that to become a priority, we'll need another P, permission. My question for you to reflect on is, from where will you find your own permission to self-care? Now, this is tough because ours is a vocation to a particular calling. Our language is of servanthood, taking up our cross, counting the needs of others greater than our own, offering ourselves as living sacrifices. Where does self-care fit into all of that? It does not clamour for our scarce time like the funeral which has just come in, or the sermon that needs writing, or the upcoming Zoom call. That need to take a break, or check out that symptom, or call a friend, or play with your child, waits silently and patiently for our permission to interrupt the busy schedule, even as it slips down the agenda until, if unacknowledged, it can explode into unexpected crisis, as I myself found. Permission requires us to know that burnout isn't like the flu or even COVID. It creeps up unannounced, and it won't just pass by unless you make deep changes in your life. As hard as that is, it remains the right thing to do, because making a few changes now will keep you in the race with plenty of fuel to get across that finish line. And surely that's what God wants too. So listen again to those weighty biblical commands. The call to take up our cross is a daily one, which presumes that we will be around again tomorrow to take it up again. The Jesus who said, "Follow me," also promised fullness of life, not fullness of calendars. And he invited those feeling the weight of religion to come to him and find rest. That Pauline exhortation to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice is one where we sometimes forget the living bit. We're not supposed to end up dead. As Parker J. Palmer puts it, self-care is never a selfish act. It is simply good stewardship of the only gift I have, the gift I was put on earth to offer to others. There's your permission. And this helps us to battle that inbuilt drive we have to be productive. Someone was sharing the guilt battle that raged between her desire to self-care and her need to get things done. Her therapist offered her this redefinition of the word productive. Perhaps, she said, productivity includes anything I do that contributes to my well-being. This takes an enormous mental shift, and it won't happen overnight. But taking that walk, playing that game, having that nap even, are all valid ways to be spending your time. And the most powerful tool that we all have to resist the cry of productivity is Sabbath. Sabbath is not another task to fit into your busy week, but rather divine invitation to turn away from the tyranny of doing towards the liberty of being. It is our escape ladder when we fall into the trap of believing our personal worth is built upon what we do rather than who we are. Asking not what have I got to do so much as who do I want to be? And the ultimate permission to self-care flows from this "who are you?" question. We are not a function of our achievements, swinging between elation at what goes well and despair at our failures. No, you and I are first and foremost a person known and loved by God. On your good days and on your bad days, in your shadow and what is in the light, you are indeed even more important than your ministry, as I discovered to my great surprise during those wilderness years. And a person who knows that they are precious and loved as they are is one whose duty and joy it is to care for one's whole self, spirit, soul, and body, to embrace well-being. Thank you.
And thank you very much to Paul Swann for that contribution, which leaves us with many things to ponder. Can I just say, please do add your comments. It's helpful to know how you're responding to things, and there's usually a minute or two to bring in a comment between the different contributions. I'm taking several things from what Paul said. Welfare begins with self-care. that burden of responsibility, which can so easily be a burden of guilt, reinforced sometimes by scriptural teaching on self-sacrifice and all the tortuous issues that this raises. What part does suffering play as part of Christian ministry and discipleship, and how much of what we suffer is self-imposed or imposed by others' expectations and demands which can't be lived up to. I think also in our particular age, the drive to be hyper-productive isn't just a church thing. It belongs to secular culture. Very aware that in the ancient world, to live a leisured life was where you sought God, and it was expected in a way that contemplation, that time was given. It took Pope Gregory I to suggest that the clergy should be busy as well as contemplative. What does Sabbath mean when Sunday is actually one of the busiest days of the week? And that wonderful Jewish contribution of worship and leisure and family, which is implied by Sabbath, all that isn't possible. Many of these stresses, of course, are around all the time, but the pandemic's had the most enormous effect on all of us in any kind of ministry. It's a common observation, I think, that ministerial training courses don't teach you all sorts of things you need to know, but the pandemic has been something which I don't think any of us could have anticipated or been prepared for, and it's had a huge effect on all of us. And it's from there that we come to our next contributor, Justine Allain-Chapman, written a book with the most wonderful title, The Resilient Disciple, one of those titles I think we're going to need to absorb and take in. And just to remind you, Church House Bookshop will send it to you, not for free, but free postage and packaging if you'd like to get hold of that. And Justine has also written about this in the Church Times this week. How the pandemic has affected clergy, clergy well-being in particular, we come on to now. So Justine, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening or late afternoon, everyone. We've heard Paul speak from the heart about the ways in which ministry can be more than weighty. It can be demanding and damaging and take us to the point of burnout. And there are internal factors and external factors. So the pandemic, I think, provides us with a kind of case study. We're still in the middle of it, but a case study of adversity and the stresses and strains that affect clergy well-being within it. And so I want to take a resilience perspective. Resilience names and acknowledges adversity straight off. It doesn't pretend, but it does draw attention to what strengthens. And the whole concept of resilience recognises the place of adversity in healing and growth, in developing wisdom and compassion. So the pandemic has brought us adversity as clergy, but not just as clergy, all of us. And as clergy, we have become more alongside, participated more in what it means to be human, perhaps, than we did before, because we were affected, just as every human being has been and is being. So I'm not going to give a long list of all the things that we're experiencing, all the stresses. Loss, though, I will mention the loss of our buildings and communal worship and sacraments at times. The loss of our ability to pastor around life events in a full way. So many restrictions on our lives. I could go on. The constantly changing regulations. Much loss, and right now, I think weariness and fatigue. We've always been used to working from home, being local. But we have lost the big space of the church building, or that has changed for us. So cast your minds back, imagine that first lockdown when our diaries went blank. And I want you to imagine a desert space and that first lockdown. The constant change in a desert of hot and cold. The fear for survival because of drought or a virus, the restrictions of space, home, no church, boundaryless time and yet so boundaried, time flattening out, and yet a surprising beauty of sand and sky, or of spring. We all know about desert, don't we? It drives us inward. It drives us to God. It drives us to face ourselves, and we have to find a path, a narrow path, a broad path. In the desert, a straight path through to make way for the Lord. So I think the pandemic has turned us upside down, and it's turned us inside out. And what have I noticed? Well, my research for clergy hasn't been statistical like some of the information that you'll get later on, but I've been doing the ministerial reviews, looking at social media, making phone calls around my archdeaconry, and I've noticed some things that I want to offer. And the first is prayer. And if you want to do P's, P for prayer. And one of the things that I have noticed is that clergy are talking about a new rhythm of life, a new rhythm of praying, and realizing that they need to look at themselves, focus on where they're at. And that prayer, because it's not just leading worship for others, which takes up quite a lot of clergy prayer and clergy time, has brought with it a self-awareness and a self-care, a resting in the presence of God. And it's not that I'm naive enough not to realise that things haven't got busy again and will always get busy again. But the picture I have had as I have listened is that of Jacob and the angel. The struggle in the darkness, the not knowing what tomorrow will bring, the restrictiveness of being held in a vice or in support, and the encountering the divine by demanding blessing and being marked. So a grappling and a personal prayer is something that I have noticed as strengthening, as being a response to the desert of the pandemic. And another thing I've noticed is pastoral care has come to the fore. Clergy have rung up people on the fringe, rung their congregations, ringing mostly, saying more, listening more than they would have done at the church door. They've rediscovered the joys of pastoral care and their skills being pastors. And you might say, and be right to say, that a refocus on the prayer and the pastoral, along with the incredibly creative virtual worship that is being offered, is what ministerial life is about. And a resilience perspective would echo that. Attention to the self, embracing the struggle, building relationships. These are key to well-being. But there's one other aspect I want to mention, another P, and that is pause. Not quite Sabbath, because Sabbath is about ceasing, and the Christian life and church life has not ceased, but there is a pause. Something has changed. Something will change. And with that, I think there is a lot of fear. Much of it is around finances, but it also scoops up all that we were already dealing with, our divisions, the loss of our reputation, decline in numbers. Almost all the clergy I've spoken to have talked about pause, and I want to suggest it's like Holy Saturday, a time of waiting, a time of grief, for life will never be the same. So were we to return to the desert in that pause, we might remember desert mothers and fathers talk about letting go and holding fast, of fleeing and staying, and that is to be our task too, of discernment as we go forward, even within the current fatigue and weariness. So I venture to say that the pandemic has bitten into clergy well-being. I've described it as a desert, as a wrestling in the night, as the coldness of the tomb. But I want to venture to say that the adversity has also brought about a deepening of prayer, of pastoral work, and a pause which can be expectant for God, of God, and in the life of the church.
Justine. That was really, really helpful. And I'm sure it's brought a lot of people to reflect on the experiences that we have in common. You spoke about the losses, the adversity, the loss and the weariness of what we learned from the desert, about the way of enduring, of hearing God, of asking. I love that, asking for blessing. I thought that was very strong, actually, almost demanding the support to carry on from God. And grappling with personal prayer. I mean, it certainly teases out. I've certainly felt this, the weaknesses in our own spiritual lives have been very much sort of revealed to us, I suspect. It's very good, those of you who are with us, to see what an enormously widespread you are. Lots and lots of people from Leighton Buzzard, Stafford, I'm just reading what it says on the comments, from Northampton, from Wantage, from St Albans, from Hartley, Kent, from Taunton, and also from Paphos, from France, from Hungary even. This is a wonderful array of people joining in tonight. And please do, if you have questions of Justine or of any of our speakers, please do come back with them. I couldn't really ask Paul, though I have a recommendation for his book from at least one of you who are joining us. I couldn't really ask him because he had pre-prepared his contribution. Justine, do you in this, you've talked a lot about the sort of the creativity and the things which have come out of this. Do you have any sense of how these things will go on and affect us long term, or do you think when we are back to normal, we'll sort of drop it all and just start again?
Some will and some won't, I suppose. That's the reality. But I would hope that there are things that we have learned and patterns and rhythms that we can form that we will shift. They say 6 weeks, the time of Lent, is about a good length of time to set up a new pattern of life. So there's still time. Yeah. So I would hope we can take what is good and know what is good to take forward.
Yeah. And one thing I've been very aware of, and it's something that we've so neglected, is how the online lessons that we've learned, how for some this can be a real lifeline, and that will go on beyond the time of the pandemic, and thinking through what we are able to offer to people who can't be with us in the flesh is a really important challenge, I think, for the church, and one that we've struggled with and perhaps not paid enough attention to. There are funny things too about the online aspect. I think some of us have, I'm speaking as a former media person, but some clergy I know have been fairly astonished to see themselves, say, presiding at the Eucharist or preaching on camera, and have learned some lessons that perhaps others were too polite to tell them about earlier. So there have been benefits to this, I think.
And we could be so much more inclusive. I mean, I've preached at Zoom services where you can see the care homes are there.
Yes.
And a kind of reaching out locally, but virtually, I think has been a very important thing that I hope we will take forward.
Yes. I'm sure you're right too about the old-fashioned telephone. You know, how much when we can't actually cross people's thresholds, that having a voice from the church community doesn't have to be the minister or the priest, but it's helpful sometimes when it is. But just seeing how people are, and it may be the best thing that's happened that day. The human voice, in a sense that someone cares and is contacting. I'm very struck myself by how the people who deliver, how much one welcomes. When I passed 70 in March, I was able to get a Sainsbury's delivery for almost the first time in my life. It was a treasured possession, I can tell you. And I'm always so glad to see people, the postmen, the people who these are the people on the front line, and they do need our support. I think it's and are welcome, and to realise how much they're valued, and that has a church connection as well. Now, I haven't yet seen any particular questions coming from those who are listening to us. We've had someone from Mallorca now, from someone in Spain. It's extraordinary width of reference that are coming into us now. And I think we can probably move on to our next contributor. We've now got, I hope perhaps he's joined us now. Do we know yet whether Simon is with us? yet?
I am indeed.
Yes. Hello, Simon. Yes, you have appeared. Are you happy to go ahead?
Thank you. Yes, I'm very much so. Good evening, everyone, and it's great to join you this evening. Every generation in the church has a buzzword, it seems, associated with the life and work of the church. There was a time when every General Synod paper, every diocesan strategy, and so much else contained the phrase collaborative ministry. Now, maybe the word of the past decade that seems to be performing the same role is the word flourish or flourishing. We're told we need flourishing churches and flourishing disciples, all served by clergy who flourish. In her excellent theological essay to accompany the publication of the Covenant for Clergy Care and Wellbeing, Dr. Margaret Whip avoids the buzzword, but she captures the primary essence of the nature of flourishing by talking about the sustenance and renewal of the clergy. Sustained and renewed by whom? By what, we might ask ourselves. Well, if as the gospel reading from the other day noted, we don't sew a new patch of cloth onto an old garment, then the life of the Christian minister is always to be formed chiefly by the never-failing streams of divine love, rather than any historical or settled pattern of Christian discipleship or praxis. This is vital to understand, I think, lest we should fall into the trap, or one might say the fantasy, of believing that any pattern of Christian ministry or ministerial lifestyle is in and of itself an answer to the problem of how to sustain Christian ministry or Christian discipleship over a lifetime. This is important to remember in these days when our selection criteria once again see women and men selected, trained and ordained in their mid-20s. What might work for a 20-something ordinand or deacon might well not work for the same priest when she's a diocesan bishop or he's a hospital chaplain later in ministry. We now have established in the church a pattern of ministerial development review and a culture where spiritual direction or the equivalent for clergy is a requirement in many places, not an optional extra. How we clergy maximize these opportunities that of the disciplines that provide, especially when it comes to our need to attend to ourselves, is a vital element of what ongoing formation looks like. The Covenant for Clergy Care and Wellbeing and the Working Party, which I was involved in, drew on this idea of covenant, so helpfully articulated by Francis Bridger in his own theological contribution to the guidelines for the professional conduct of the clergy some years ago. Covenant is a dynamic rather than a static idea. Just as professional standards change over the years, so our needs to be sustained and renewed in ministry also change. We only just need, as Justine's just been saying, to look back a year, and I think about my own well-being pre-COVID and during COVID. They seem very different. But what hasn't changed is the undertaking that I made at my ordination and my institution and induction. What hasn't changed is the commitment that my parishioners made when I joined them as parish priest. And what hasn't changed is the undertaking that the church made through the office of the bishop who ordained and now licenses me to offer pastoral care, counsel and the wisdom of the church. All these things, the people of my congregation and the Church of England and I myself are dynamic living organisms, open both to the wind of the Spirit and the frailties that accompany our individual, our congregational and institutional life. They will each in their turn give life or take life from one another. And for that matter, really importantly, each will project onto the others their own failure to live up to their hard calling, the sin of us all in the Church of England, I think. This means that in such a dynamic and changing context, the ordained minister will need both perseverance, stabilitas, to use the Benedictine word, in remaining faithful and consistent in such an environment. At the same time, to keep the Benedictine ideal going, conversatio morum, the conversion of life, or perhaps how we remain faithful personally, vocationally, while remaining always open to change and growth. So the Covenant for Clergy Care and Wellbeing is aimed to encourage stabilitas and conversatio morum. Clergy are invited to ongoing regular reflection on this in their own ministries. Congregations are vitally asked to think more actively about their own contribution to the care and well-being of their clergy, something perhaps that, if not new, won't have been so explicit up to now. And in the wider church, expressed through the office of the bishop, they're asked to ponder how they can help, or perhaps where they hinder, the ministry and well-being of the clergy. And framing this as a conversation, as the Covenant for Clergy Care and Wellbeing does, between the static and the dynamic held in tension, so the minister, the congregation and the wider church can over time develop a practice of attending to well-being and care of the clergy in the context of all that they're called to do. So we have sustenance and renewal. This covenantal concept, of course, is rooted in the divine covenant we know in Jesus, and that wonderful Old Testament word chesed, covenant love. The grace of God given to us in baptism and conferred in some way in a sacramental moment of ordination is always there, underpinning us as we wrestle with the weight of our calling. My own experience of resilience in ministry, and I think we should remember that we need resilience both in wellness as well as in unwellness. That was the impetus that brought us the idea of a covenant into the wider church. And I've been hugely encouraged by the way in which people have responded to this idea. It recognizes that there are times when, in respect of clergy care and well-being, the church and my congregation and I myself can be anything but my best friend, and can also be anything but my worst enemy. Wherever on that spectrum we lie at any one time, the particular hesed of God remains. And as we minister as deacon, priest and bishop, and enter into that dialogue that the covenant offers, I hope each and every one of us can find strength for the journey within ourselves and beyond ourselves. And I hope, therefore, it's a gift to each and every one of us in the Church of England.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think that's really helpful, and it said so many things about the very particular way in which Church of England history and formation, it both forms and sometimes deforms and sometimes conforms and sometimes reforms us. You know, it's a constant process of formation and reformation and learning. And you stressed there the Benedictine influence on the covenant, the sense of chesed, of being within the constant grace of God and the stability that goes with all of that, very helpfully. I wondered if you might have anything to say to those who are in pioneer ministries, where in a sense the aim has not been to replicate the local and traditional pattern quite so much, but to live in a way more off one's initiative, spirit-led initiative. Yes, well,
I mean, very often those places can be more nourishing as well. I mean, many pioneers thrive on novelty and new ideas, but pioneer ministry is never detached ministry, and I think the question for pioneers is always going to be how do they remain in that tension between wanting to be entrepreneurial and how they want to be connected to the rest of the Church of England. We haven't set up in all these wonderful things about pioneer ministry a separate way of doing things, but an extension. And I think there's got to be some further thought on the issues about how we support those pioneers as we learn more about what their needs are.
Yes, I've often thought in terms of spirituality, we were well trodden in a sort of Anglican adaptation of the Benedictine way, that the pioneer minister has perhaps more in common with the Ignatian way of, responding in the moment to the gifts and demands that God is making right now. But I've not seen that developed. I just think is an interesting contrast, because we can both learn from so many different strands of spiritual wisdom in the church's life. I have one question. I've lost, I'm afraid, where it's come from at the moment, but someone asked, I think it may have been Julie Minturn in Oxford Diocese, who asks about the place of lamentation. How do we express the kind of sorrow that is within us? It's like the psalm about how can I sing songs of Zion. How is that expressed?
That's a really good at the moment, where our church is open, but we've created lots of new services this week, lots of tiny little services for people to come to, and we're exploring the Psalms of Lament this very week, Angela, which is really, so it's a really interesting question. We have to, we have these resources in our own daily devotion, and we just don't use them very well, do we? We sort of pass over them, and I would hope that perhaps we should just stop and stay with them for a while. There's always the tendency to run, I preached on Psalm 13 last Sunday, there's a tendency to run on to the last two verses. There's an awful lot of gap between, where are you, Lord, but I trust in your love.
Yes.
We have to, learning to live in the gap, as Justine was saying, that sort of pause is something that I think, that's why we spend so much time in prayer, isn't it? So that when those times come, there's much to be called on, that we've stored up in some way.
Yes, I think the duty and need to just express the sadness is important sometimes. Thank you very much, Simon. That was really, really helpful to us all. There's a very personal and pastoral quality to the ministry in the Church of England, and I think it's at best reflected when there's good relationships between parish clergy and their bishop. I'm very glad to have the Bishop of Worcester, John Inge, with us this evening. Many years ago, Bishop John licensed me to be Vicar of St Benet's in Cambridge, so I'm very grateful for that, and to look back on that experience with fondness. That how, Bishop John, if you can talk to this particular dilemma, how can bishops help at this time?
Angela, thank you. It's very good to be with you. Good evening to you and to everyone else, wherever you may be. What about the bishops? Well, I, in thinking about this, thought I should return to the ordinal and be reminded that bishops are called to care for the flock of Christ in general, and more specifically, as chief pastors, it's their duty to share with their fellow presbyters in the oversight of the church. Bishops are not chief executives or managers, but, as the ordinal makes clear, overseers. I am not the line manager of the clergy of this diocese. That's clear in law. I bear the scars of having been taken to the Court of Appeal by a priest who was intent on proving that clergy are employees. The court found otherwise. Clergy are office holders. And when you stop to think about it, that means that the church is unique. There is, as far as I'm aware, no other organisation in which all the paid workers, and indeed voluntary workers, have such freedom and autonomy. Those in senior positions in other walks of life may have a fair amount of discretion, but never does the whole workforce have it. And I think that's a precious thing. I don't want to tell the clergy of this diocese what they should be doing on a Monday morning, or at any other time for that matter. Now, during my ministry, I've been a parish priest, a chaplain, a residentiary canon, and a bishop, and I see more continuity between those roles than difference. And I suppose as a bishop, I think of the clergy of the diocese as I might have thought of the congregation of a church of which I was incumbent. And of course, I have a responsibility towards those beyond the congregation, but I have a particular responsibility to care for and nurture those within it. In the role of parish priest or bishop, I find the most helpful analogy, and I worked this out years ago, was to think of myself as the director of a play. or as I developed it, as a pantomime. My job is to try to bring the best out of the cast so that their energy and God-given creativity and gifting can be released and the production go well. My role now as a bishop is not to bombard the clergy with initiatives or ad clarums in a pandemic or at any other time, but pray God to be an encouraging, non-anxious presence in their midst, discerning where God's energy is and fanning that flame. Episcopae, as the ordinal makes clear, is a shared task, and we certainly need to improve our shared care for one another. Simon will be pleased to hear that in this diocese we're committed to embracing the 2020 Act of Synod, proclaiming, and affirming the covenant for clergy care and well-being. We've appointed a member of the bishop's staff as Dean of Wellbeing and published a Flourishing in Ministry document, which is being rolled out, like you do vaccines, for consultation. The chair of the House of Laity is taking the lead on fronting it. Like all episcopae, this must be a shared task. I begin the foreword to the Flourishing in Ministry document by quoting our Lord's summary of the law. I often hear that reduced to loving God and loving neighbour, but of course there are three vertices, not two: God, neighbour and self. And in my experience, personal and ministerial, it's the last of these three that followers of Jesus find most problematic. Maybe we're too immersed in the command to deny oneself, even of dying to self. There's a proper self-love, though, which sets one free to love one's neighbour and enable them to find life in abundance as well as oneself. In Acts 20, before telling the leaders of the church in Ephesus to be shepherds of the church, Paul instructs them to keep watch over yourselves and over all the flock, of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Keep watch over yourselves. As clergy, indeed, as Christians, this doesn't just apply to clergy, we ourselves have primary responsibility under God to care for ourselves. My role as bishop, I think, is to set a good example and encourage others to look after themselves. Of course, there are many things which militate against us doing this. There will be unrealistic expectations on us. That's nothing new, we might remind ourselves. It's just nowadays focused on different things. Years ago, it used to be that the clergy didn't visit. The parish on Tyneside, there was a story about of which I was vicar, a vicar just after the war, who used to rush down the terraced streets of terraced houses, shoving visiting cards in the door and moving on before anyone had a chance to answer the door. But whatever other people place upon us in terms of expectations, it seems to me that our most unrealistic expectations come from within, precisely because we don't really love ourselves. We preach a gospel of grace and unconditional love, but we live as if we need to prove ourselves to God and others, and maybe the bishop, maybe the archbishop. It's no accident, I think, that Pelagius came from these islands. Mentioning archbishops, Rowan Williams and Justine Welby, both of whom I admire greatly, are very, very different people. But it seems to me that they have one thing in common. They are both, more or less, as I observe them, at ease in their own skin. If that's not true for us, we need to work on it. If we're going to experience that fullness of life which Jesus yearns to give us, we need to learn to be at home in our own skin, for our own sake, but also for the sake of those to whom we minister. Too many leaders are working out their agenda on others, and not just in the church. We need to ask ourselves, what drives us? John Cleese, some of you will remember, wrote a wonderful book with his therapist Robin Skinner years ago entitled Life and How to Survive It. There's a huge amount of distilled psychological wisdom in it, accessibly articulated. One chapter is headed, "Look, Daddy, I'm the chairman of Consolidated International." If we're wanting to prove ourselves, who is it really to? And of course, many of the things which form us and bind us down will be from our long distant past. A friend of mine once spoke to a group of teenagers and she told them something they didn't want to hear. She said, most of them, the most important things that will ever happen to you in your life have already happened. Now, I can't answer the question about what drives us for clergy, but I need to try to avoid colluding in infantilizing them and discourage them from projecting their demanding daddy image onto me. We're called to love not just God and others, but ourselves. I have to confess, I'm not keen on us thinking ourselves as professionals. Professionals have clients, and there is a professional distance between them and their clients. I believe we're called to be amateurs in the true sense of the word. Its root is love. We're called to love those to whom we're called, as well as ourselves. That doesn't mean, of course, that there's any excuse for incompetence or sloppiness. If, when they say we're to be professional people or have professional standards, people mean that we're to be competent in the tasks assigned to us, then I wholeheartedly agree. But I wish they'd say so. Anyway, the amateur will surely be competent and thorough. We want to give of our very best to those whom we love. That said, we need to care for ourselves. And as we do so, we need to pay particular attention to boundaries. As I've observed, as clergy, as bishops, and as priests, and as deacons, and as lay people, I suppose, unless we're employed by someone else, we have immense freedom. So there's a danger of boundaries becoming blurred. What is our relationship to those to whom we minister? They're not our clients, but they're not our friends. It's a unique relationship, and there are obvious elephant traps of inappropriate boundaries developing, but there are also more insidious ones, like being consumed by individuals in great need. We are not indispensable. The boundaries question applies to time too. Ministering as we do and being based at home can make it difficult to switch off. We need to recall that one of the things that's striking about Jesus, as we read of him in the Gospels, is his radical unavailability, his withdrawing. One of my favourite encounters is in the first chapter of St. Mark's Gospel. It must have been meant humorously, surely. His disciples find Jesus looking for him all night, and when they find him, they exclaim, "Everyone's looking for you." His response? Let's go somewhere else. Let me end by telling you about the ministry game. I learnt it years ago from another bishop. It's a monopoly like a board game. When you throw the dice, you're confronted with pastoral dilemmas. And then you are awarded you're awarded various kinds of points: health, job satisfaction, relationship, and guilt points. So, for example, the dice makes you throw up the pastoral dilemma. You promise to go out for a meal with your daughter and someone who's suicidal calls. So what's your response? Well, if you say, "Sorry, darling, I'm afraid we'll have to postpone," and go and see the suicidal person, you might gain a job satisfaction point, lose a relationship point, lose a health point, and gain 2 guilt points. If you tell the suicidal person to find someone else, you might gain a health and a relationship point. You'd maybe lose a job satisfaction point, but you'd certainly gain 2 or more guilt points. The thing is that the guilt points just keeping on accumulating. Well, as Christians, they shouldn't. Do they? Do we love ourselves? God loves us just as we are. So we have no excuse for not doing so ourselves, even if the bishop doesn't love us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop John. That was really good to hear that, and so many things there about not being a line manager and things that we do need to remind ourselves of and hear. I mean, I have to say, having worked not in the church for a long time, a really good line manager, I came to think, is actually rather like a bishop at their best. You know, the shepherding that can happen when people take care of and want those working with them to flourish. But it's not to be taken for granted. And the lovely thing you said about sharing oversight reminded me of that marvelous sort of lucid little quotation from Pope John Paul I, that he thought that the role, if it was a priest or a bishop, was to oversee, see everything, change a little, forgive much. I thought that was very profound, actually, and pertinent.
There's the other, on a more light-hearted note, that as the bishop as an overseer, we're called to oversee, and there are things which it's best for us to overlook.
Yes,
There are different types of overseeing.
How wise. Yes, absolutely. No, I get that. But that non-anxious presence, I think, that's, as an anxious person myself, and I'm anxious in ministry and out of it, it's a challenge, and almost has to, work up an idea of oneself as a non-anxious presence and try to grow into it. So this is what God might be calling me to. Well, we've had a lot of responses to this, and you made a big point, important point about getting the boundaries right. Some sort of practical hints of how we might look after ourselves well, to have some guidelines. And some of these have been provided, I notice it's in this week's Church Times, by Liz Graveling, the Research Officer for the Church of England's Ministry Division and the author of How Clergy Thrive. Liz, are you with us now? Carry on. I don't think we can hear you at the moment. Is that... Let's just check technically whether... Oh, that's better. Speak.
Is it better now? Can
That's
you hear
better.
me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. That's great.
Oh, although I can't hear you now.
Just carry
on. Well, if you can hear me, I'll carry on anyway. Okay. So yeah, well-being. Do you know what? Sometimes when I mention well-being, I see a look come across people's faces, a kind of a pause in the conversation, and it's a look and a pause that kind of sits uncomfortably with such a positive topic as well-being, because it's a look of guilt and defensiveness sometimes, and failure, and just tiredness. And it's the same look that probably comes across my face when you talk about eating your 5 a day, or ethical shopping, or not buying plastic, or any of the other things that we're supposed to do. We're talking about the weight of calling, but sometimes well-being itself can weigh heavy as a chore, as a burden, as something we know we should be doing, but we're just not very good at it. So here's a gift. 6 things that might help. They're very flexible, they're also quite challenging, and they're all really just about being kind. So these are principles drawn from research that we in the National Ministry team have been doing for the past 4 years or so. We've been talking to clergy about their experiences of ordained ministry and the things that hinder and the things that help their well-being. These are some of the things that help. They're about self-care, and we heard the importance of that from Paul and from lots of other speakers earlier. But they're also about caring for others, and this is really important. So as I talk through them, think about how you could apply them for your own well-being, but also, especially if you're someone in a position of responsibility for others, think about how you might be able to create the conditions and the encouragement for other people to do these things, because responsibility for well-being is shared. So 6 principles, some of them have been touched on already. It's nice to make those connections. 1 for each letter of the word thrive. So T stands for tune your life to healthy rhythms. Rhythms of prayer, of work, of rest, of play, of exercise, of nutrition, daily rhythms, weekly rhythms, monthly, yearly. I've used the word rhythms rather than routines, because rhythms are flexible and varied. They might speed up, they might slow down, they might pause. And during the pandemic, we've had to radically alter our rhythms. And those are some of the things that keep us going. And a rhythm usually has something else going alongside it. So all sorts of notes interwoven in it. Rhythms are not the whole of our lives. They're the underlying beat that keeps us grounded. H is for handle expectations. We've just heard Bishop John talk about expectations. And we know that misunderstandings and mismatched expectations are a massive cause of stress and frustration. So being honest about what we can expect from others, what others can expect from us, and what we can expect from ourselves can really help to relieve pressure, avoid guilt, frustration, and conflict. None of us is perfect, and we don't have to pretend that we are. R is for recognise moments of vulnerability, because we won't be well all the time, and sometimes are just really hard, as we know all so well. We've all lived through the last year. sometimes we are just not well. And if it's possible, sometimes it is to anticipate times when or others will be vulnerable, then we can put things in place to mitigate against that. But we can also acknowledge the challenges, the effect they're having, name them, not try to hide it or deny it, and to take extra care of ourselves during those times. I is for identify safe spaces to be heard. Safe spaces, we all need them, don't we? We all need to be real and honest and open with people we can trust, whether that's family or friends or spiritual directors or mentors or counsellors or clergy. And it's good to have that support network in place, even when we feel we don't need it. It's good when we don't need it, and it's good to have it in place in advance, but when we do. V is for value and affirm. And this is one that works in all directions. We can all value and affirm each other. And ultimately, as we've heard, we need to know that we're utterly known and understood and valued and loved by God. It helps if we can show that for each other as well. E is for establish healthy boundaries. And I know from all the listening I've done over the past years with clergy that this is so hard in clergy life, where boundaries of time and space and role and mental boundaries and relational boundaries are often blurred and difficult to work out, as Bishop John was just saying. And it brings us back to rhythms again. So identifying what's important and nurturing the heartbeat or the heartbeats of our life. So there's your gift. 6 things that we can do to support our own well-being and perhaps the well-being of others as well. But most importantly, and this is really important, they're all about kindness. So being kind to ourselves and being kind to each other.
Liz, thank you very much indeed. That's a really helpful 6 things to put up on the wall and look at every day, read off the mirror, tell each other when we need to. I hope you can hear us a little bit. We've had really almost a full hour on our contributors and some comments that have come from them. There have been some lovely comments. Hilary Ison suggests that we should be aiming for a less anxious presence rather than a non-anxious presence. I found that very helpful, Hilary. Thank you for that. And the dilemmas, some of the ones that perhaps we haven't touched on that we might in the second half, of how we cope with that underlying pressure all the time to do a good show and to have success, to get our numbers up, where there seems very much less, understandably perhaps, much less support and sustenance for where actually this is not a congregation that's going to grow for all sorts of demographic reasons and other reasons which may be completely beyond our control. How do we deal with that when everything, not just in society but in church, drives us to feel you can make a difference, we can around. Well, I think for now we'll take a break, a good 5 minutes, I think, to do whatever we need to do in that time, and then come back for a fuller question and answer session in which our contributors will be ready to take some questions. Thanks very much.
what we do is really important. The Christian church has to be united, and it can't be united if it doesn't know what's going on. The range of stories we cover is universal. The approach we have is comprehensive.
We're looking to help people, with ministry, mission. We also publish positive, constructive content, which aims to help the church be a better church, and that's what we care about.
But we also look at things incredibly in depth. We take a lot of time with our stories, make sure that they're accurate, that they're very detailed, and the reader is not left asking questions at the end.
It enlightens bits of the world that don't get reported elsewhere.
I think what's really important about the Church Times is it's independent. We're not affiliated to any other organisation, so we're really free in what we can write.
If the church screws up, then we report it. If the church does something fantastic, then we report it. We deliberately don't have our own agenda.
One of my favourite things about the Church Times is our book reviews. I think it's really important because it points clergy and really interested lay people to what some of the latest theology is, academic theology, but also books about spirituality, things like prayer, and also social issues.
Subscribers can access 150 years of past issues through the Church Times' own website, which is linked to the UK Press online site, and they can look at any of the issues since 1863 page by page.
So I really enjoy doing a cartoon for the Church Times when I've got a really strong idea and I know that it's something that the readers will enjoy.
A huge part of the service we provide the church is advertising jobs specifically for clergy, but also for musicians, teachers, youth workers and so on.
The Church Times runs the Festival of Preaching, which is a chance for clergy and readers and anyone else who's interested to really explore the craft of preaching. The Festival of Faith and Literature is a literary festival with a theological slant, at which questions of faith and theology are explored. The Church Times Cricket Cup has been going since 1951. When they put on their cricket whites, the different traditions and the things that might divide them become much less significant, and it's definitely plays some role in helping forge Christian unity. The Church Times also runs the Green Awards together with the Church of England's Shrinking the Footprint campaign. It's a way to celebrate those churches that are leading the way in being good stewards of the environment.
One of the things that we do is start a dialogue between various groups in the church and really try and represent all views.
You ought to be able to read the Church Times and come out at the end of it more excited about what your Christian life is like.
The podcast was set up almost a year ago, and really the idea was to be a place where we could talk about the background of stories, how we came upon stories, provide some analysis of what's going on in the church and the wider world.
The Church Times is available on old-fashioned bits of paper. It's available on your phone, your computer, your tablet. There's an app. We make it as accessible as we possibly can. We're always looking for more subscribers, and if anybody wants to, it's terribly easy. All they have to do is go to the website, or they can even phone up.
Here we are again, everybody, and welcome back after that brief break for the Church Times. I suppose I should do my own plug for the Church Times. We think it's a very good thing, Church Times, and please carry on, especially when you make us laugh, because those are the bits which we perhaps benefit from more than anything else. Quite a lot of questions and comments have come in to us today, and it's difficult to know where to start, really, but I think what I will start with quite a tricky issue, which has come up in various ways. A lot of what our contributors have presented us with is to do with, as individuals, how we deal with the stresses and finding resilience in our own personal ministries and lives. But what, and Philip Morton asks this, what about the systemic problems? When I was in Oxford and was dealing with ministerial development, we had a system, person, role and system. We used to talk about that, these ideally in ministry, these overlap. You can see sort of three hoops put on the ground is how we used to do it. And sort of there's a bit in the middle where person, role and system all come together. But actually, sometimes that doesn't work so well. And identifying which of the three is the misfit and what you do about it, because these things are not very easy. I wonder if I could take that one, whether Simon, you might be available to look at how do we deal with the system as well as with ourselves? It's a bit unfair to throw that at you, or are you okay to?
Well, I mean, I think I don't actually think that there's many walks of life, whether ordained or in any form of secular employment, where people don't have to work within a system. I mean, systems are in and of themselves the same as any other structure that we have in life. The question, I suppose, is when an institution, an organization lacks vision and lacks the energy to bring that vision into being, what it can be left with is just the empty husk of the system that was put in place to make that vision come about. I reckon that part of the challenge we have in the church is that we've got quite a bit of that still around now. We've got systems that are no longer fit for the delivery of what we think ministry and mission and the life of the church is for now. And as a result of that, people come up against that in perhaps a more hard-faced way. Now, in saying all of that, I recognize that for others, and people have mentioned in the comments I've noticed, some of the elements of the system, statements of particulars, clergy discipline, even things like ministerial reviews can be unwelcome imposition on the freedom that we have. But I think one of the ways to see the system is not necessarily to see it necessarily as the enemy, but as the way, when it works well, that the church shapes its life in order to give life. And if we believe in a tradition that is evolving, then there's something always in the way we do things that can nurture and sustain. But it would be a very strange minister indeed who didn't kick against the system in some way or another. I think that's the nature of who we train in the Church of England. We want people who don't conform and who protest about the way the world is. And if we don't have those people, then we aren't the church we should be.
It's a complicated one, isn't it? Because I've listened to many clergy sort of trying to work this one out, and I think you're absolutely right that in a sense we look for people who have something distinctive to offer, look for individuals who may be contained within themselves a certain frustration, anger sometimes at the way the world is. I can see all that, but then very often not only do they find themselves sort of with a lot of huge amounts of paperwork and things to be filled in rather rigorous ways that seem to sort of exclude the life of them. It gets really complicated, and I suspect part of the problem is that there's the old and the new don't mesh easily at the moment.
There's another thing, Angela, I think that might take us in a different direction. I mean, the Church of England has always been a compromise between what you might call progressive and conservative and traditional and Catholic and evangelical and reformed and all of those things. And at different points in the life of the church, different elements of that rich diversity gets emphasized more. And those who don't sit comfortably with that prevailing mood of the church, if we might say at the moment that the flavor of that is perhaps more in the evangelical wing of the church is having an ascendancy at the moment, then others will naturally feel less comfortable about it. And that would have been the case for evangelicals 50 years ago when the church wasn't. And that, I think, is just in the DNA of being the Church of England. We're always going to live with feeling as though we don't quite fit, because there are always people that don't seem like they're either proper Christians or proper Catholics or proper liberals or whatever they might be.
Yes, the difficulty is accepting the fact that the space is, in a way, constructed to be quite cool, so that in a way you don't get the domination of one particular group who know they're right and want to impose that on the others. And that means that inevitably the centre has to be a little bit, it's that mixture of intimacy and detachment, which is quite difficult, I think, for ministry to negotiate. A number of people have asked about chaplaincy, and I mean, quite understandably have said we've been very parish focused in this, and that often tends to be the way. But chaplaincy brings, it's always seemed to me, with a little experience in this area, but there's both a particular individuality about many forms of chaplaincy, the friendships and the offering of friendship in hospital and service setting and police and all sorts of other things, but also the fact that you're actually in a different structure, and that often in a way, the way the Church of England works, the officers of the Church of England don't particularly, unless they have a special way of doing so, know what's going on for chaplains in the way that they do about parish ministers. I wonder who'd like to talk about that. Justine, would you have something to say on chaplaincy? Say no if you don't want to, but just throw it in. I can't hear you, I'm afraid. We seem to have... You're not quite with us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're there. I think you are for everybody. Great, good.
I think chaplains are on the borderlands, and so don't fit into the parish structures in the way in which we're describing them here. I think we are very focused on clergy in parishes at the moment. And I suppose I would say that chaplains are experiencing the pandemic and experiencing the impact or lack of impact on the church in public life in different kinds of ways. And so attention needs to be given distinctly to chaplains. I suppose one thing I'd want to say in this discussion is that clergy are remarkable people, and as such really difficult to manage. And we are office holders and not employees. And so we have tremendous freedom, but it doesn't feel like freedom because of our inner drivers, because of our inner call. And chaplains work in quite boundaried ways because of the institutions which they work for. And that means they are grappling with massively difficult things, but different things. And sometimes clergy can get into a grass is greener on the other side. It would be all right if I could just hand over to somebody else like I could, or might be able to if I was a chaplain, or have boundary time, and it might be good if I had a big house, that sort of thing. And perhaps that's where kindness comes in.
Yes, thank you. Liz, do you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, can you hear me?
You are the Minister of Kindness, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Oh,
that's
wonderful,
fine.
brilliant. Yes, so the research that we've been doing has spoken to, or listened rather, to chaplains as well as to parish clergy, and it's been really interesting doing that and hearing the different pressures that they're under. And obviously, during the pandemic, there's been a lot of hospital chaplains in particular, but also other chaplains working in prisons and schools and other places have been under a lot of pressure and working with people right in the depths of their emotions and really hard times. I think as Justine was saying, chaplains, as we listen to them, that they tend, or especially those who have two roles, so a chaplaincy role and a parish role, tends to kind of talk about the chaplaincy role as the boundaried one, where they know where they are, they can switch off, maybe harder mentally, but at least go home from it to a certain extent. But at the same time, often feel on the edge of the diocese and kind of marginalised to a certain extent from other clergy and what's going on there. So I think there are different pressures, and it's important not to forget those who aren't in parish ministry, and of course remember that a lot of people are in both as well.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, as we're onto this, I mean, there's all kinds of groups, self-supporting ministers, readers, people who have their. I mean, one of the things that always rather frustrated me about the Church of England is we all terribly want to be affirmed, and we all spend a lot of time affirming others. That's part of what we're there to do. But actually, there's no kind of there's no kind of limit to how much one can be affirmed, and sometimes one just has to get on with it without being affirmed, because that's the nature of the beast, really, because it's the kind of cost of the independence that we actually have. And I think sometimes there's a kind of a tension within ourselves which is quite difficult to, it's the kind of thing that Bishop John was talking about, that it's actually it's a very strange role, not quite professional, not quite amateur. You're formed in it, and yet you go on growing, and you have needs, and yet at times you have to forego those needs in order to minister to other people. It is really complex in some ways, and I think that sometimes we don't allow ourselves for the fact that this is a heavy calling. That's what our title has been, and it's the weight of this calling is a very real thing. And of course, what the ordinal tells us is to rely on God and to trust in God, and not to look too far, perhaps, for the system to cope with us. Anyone want to come in on the story? That was a very woolly thread. Come on, Bishop, speak.
Thank you. I'll comment on both questions, if I may. Firstly, on chaplaincy, I was thinking when I was speaking mostly of parochial clergy, but as someone who I have been a non-stipendiary. I've acted in chaplaincy in the past, and I recognise the pressures. But I did mention that actually I see more continuity between the very different roles that I've been called to, be it chaplaincy, be it residentiary canonry, be it parish priest. It's just, and I think that the pressures are different. And I mean, it's a blessing and a curse. So what I was concentrating on is how free parochial clergy are, and that's not true in chaplaincy, of course. But for some parish clergy, being quite so free is a burden, because it's very difficult to know when you're working and when you're not. It's very difficult to set the boundaries. It's very difficult to know when you've achieved something. If you have particular working hours in a hospital or a school or a prison, you can fool yourself that you've done something worthwhile, even if you haven't. So I think there are different aspects, but I do accept that there are very different pressures, and sometimes it's difficult for us as bishops to respond as well as we might to those in other forms of ministry. I think that the question that Philip raised, very discerning question, as you'd expect from a very fine priest from the Diocese of Worcester. I think the systemic question is a really important one. And the fact is, of course, that we need constantly to be reforming. The church needs to be reformed, and there are lots of things, as Simon intimated, that we need to work on. And it used to be said, doesn't it, that the Church of England has the engine of a lawnmower and the brakes of a juggernaut. We're not terribly quick at reforming, and that's partly, I suppose, because of the dispersed nature of authority within our systems. Every parish priest is king or queen within their cure. So there are difficulties with that. But I think the other thing to bear in mind in this, I mean, Angela, you mentioned about all the admin that people are burdened with. I mean, I do say to clergy that if they really think they've got too much admin to deal with, they should go and spend a day with someone in another caring profession, a doctor, a teacher, a social worker, someone like that. I mean, frankly, we have a lot less to contend with. I have rather more now as a bishop, but I still have a lot less, I think, than in other walks of life. But the other thing to bear in mind, it seems to me, when we're thinking about the systems, I mean, it was mentioned that clergy tend to be those who have something individual to offer, and that can mean that those internal drivers to which reference has been made will make us kick against the goad. Robin Skinner, John Cleese's therapist, wrote with John Cleese 2 books, Life and How to Survive It and Families and How to Survive Them. He wrote another more academic tome on his own, which is entitled Institutions and How to Survive Them. And the basic thesis of that long rather academic tome is that when in the way in which we relate to institutions, we will either be trying to recreate or react against our family dynamic when we were a child. It's sometimes said that the church and the military are the most dependency inducing organizations, and I think we need to pay attention to that. So I would, of course, we need to pay attention to systems. Of course, we need to be reforming, but I think we need also always to direct attention back to ourselves. And I'm speaking as a fool and preaching to myself as much as to anyone else.
I think that's a very, very helpful insight, the question about the families. I've often wondered, why did Jesus call 12? Was this the number of the kind of normal family, a place where you could work out the dynamics of fraternity, and what you really thought about the things that were going on between you, because so often the sort of conflicts that happen in the Gospels seem to be sort of rivalries and competitiveness and those sorts of things. And I'm sure you're right that in many ways our relationship with the institution, with the parish, do reflect those family patterns that we've inherited, and it's helpful. I'm very aware that we've talked a lot today, sort of boundaring the areas of therapy and care, because that's part of what we work in. We haven't really talked in the rather more, don't want to separate the two languages off completely, but the sort of more rigorous scriptural language of sort of sin and failure, guilt and weakness that we read about in scripture, we have in the liturgy, and it seems to me sometimes re-inhabiting that rather solemn language is quite objective. It's quite out there. It gives us sheds a different kind of light on our dilemmas than the therapeutic ones, which somehow always seem to want us to be well. Well, of course, we're talking about wellness and resilience, and that's quite right. But there is a realism about being in a fallen and broken world, and how it is to minister in that fallen and broken world. Anyone like to comment on that? Because some of the comments I'm picking up, not reading them because they do reflect a degree of personal pain that doesn't want to be quoted by somebody, but because I'm aware that some of the comments do reflect that. Who would like to speak into that sense? Are we aware of? Yeah.
I'll say something. I mean, I think I find that language of that biblical language in some senses much more helpful, although I can use the psychological language as well and understand its place. I constantly find, and I'm sure many other colleagues do as well, that in ministry, that it is my weaknesses, it is my vulnerabilities that are the places where, when they are exposed, however uncomfortable they are, that God tends to take that and uses it for the well-being and betterment of others, in a gracious way. And and whatever others think about this, I have found what I thought, for example, about my sexuality, and that's an area where clergy are very vulnerable in many ways. What I thought about my sexuality wasn't what God thought about it, and as a result of that, it's become a real gift and a place in which and from which I can minister much more effectively, because of that. My strength can be found in weakness model, that cross-shaped ministry that is at the heart of what Christian ministry is about, and that refreshment and fear of facing up to the realities of who I am is a sure sign of my unwellness in ministry as well, a sure sign of my lack of resilience. And I think that very often when colleagues get themselves into difficulty, it is that we fail to note our own shadow, our own dark side, the things that we bring that out of our own experience of harm or sin that inflict themselves on others. And would that we could know ourselves more effectively, we will be more effective ministers.
Yes.
Could Could I say, Angela, that I mean, of course, all the things that you mentioned should be primary for us, but I'd be really sad if we felt it necessary to push a wedge between a therapeutic approach and what might be called a sin and redemption approach. I mean, to me, salvation is about healing. It's about wholeness, and we won't reach it in this world. But at the same time, we're called to proclaim God's loving forgiveness in the face of the sinfulness in which we found ourselves, the brokenness in which we find ourselves. It's always seemed to me that actually Jesus got there first with a lot of those what now might be called therapeutic insights. So, for example, cognitive therapy. Look at the lilies of the field; they neither toil nor spin. I mean, Jesus was suggesting that we might concentrate on the positive. So, I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot more in common between those models. I mean, one can find ways of driving a wedge between them, but I would want to find links. But of course, at root, we are made in the image of God, but we are fallen human beings. But we have been redeemed, and we should seek healing and wholeness. In the gospel, healing was Jesus always associated forgiveness with healing. They always went together, and the church has shied away from that. And I think they belong together. I years ago found myself confessing the same old sins over and over and over again. And I thought, well, and I knew I was forgiven, but what was happening? And then I suddenly thought, well, actually, I probably the deep reason for me sinning is a feeling of dis-ease inside. I need healing. Jesus linked them together. So I hope that the healing, the salvation, which might be associated with a therapeutic model, can be linked with the one of sin and forgiveness. They belong together. They should be integrated, it seems to me.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that's right. There have been a number of people who have asked difficult questions about clergy discipline, about CDMs, about this. I know this whole process is being reconsidered at the moment. But and beneath that, the really very tricky situations which some find themselves in when they are under a kind of systemic abuse from congregations or from the institutions in which they work. That's not an unusual situation. And it's, I know from the experience of many people how incredibly painful that is, and how difficult it is to untangle, really, when it's in the middle. Who has something to offer on that? Justine, I feel that I'm looking at you as the sort of bishop's eyes, as the Archdeacon, the sort of spirit of discipline, sort of, that you're going to tell us something about how you approach those issues.
I think the issues around clergy discipline are about complaints coming in, and sometimes I feel as an archdeacon as if I'm the customer services department of the Church of England. Yes. And complaints can come in of the most trivial to the most serious. Of course, you can have a complaint that somebody obviously gets up very late on their day off because he keeps his curtains closed all day and never opens them, and this isn't good for the village. So dealing with people have got a voice and they want to complain, and when somebody complains about you, it feels terrible, and in a sense you can't take away from that. My approach to complaints is pastorally. For most complaints, I go and see the complainant, and they want somebody to say sorry for something that went wrong, and they want it not to happen again. And most complaints are pastoral, and as clergy it's really difficult for us to say sorry sometimes, because there are those who would slam us over the head. And some people are working in incredibly difficult environments in terms of conflict, and getting help where you can, so important. I've found bridge builders very useful in that, and the chat talked about a less anxious presence, and certainly my bridge builders training has helped me that where I can have a less anxious presence in a situation, I can help to heal or find a way forward in complex situations. That's one aspect of complaints, is relationships having gone wrong, but not forever and ever. It's a point on a journey. But the clergy discipline measure is being reviewed, being renewed, and it needs to be.
There are so many complications around this, aren't there, in many different situations? But I think it has become a dread. I know a particularly resilient priest, retired now, who had seemed to be a rather good attitude towards CDMs. She had about 12, I think, issued against her. And they were all vexatious. I mean, there was a huge history of a former priest who'd been abusive in all sorts of ways, and this was a sort of getting back at the past of all of that.
I'm a member of the group that's reviewing the CDM, and I think we're all agreed that it's not fit for purpose.
No.
And it's particularly difficult. I mean, of course, there are very serious complaints of conduct which are very clearly unbecoming, but it's become a vehicle for people to, as Justine, as you're saying, to just get at people. And I mean, in most dioceses, I hope that there is an attempt by archdeacons or others to diffuse things, but it just needs wholesale reform. It's not fit for purpose.
And I think the time it takes, it makes it very difficult. You know, you do attend to it properly. You attend to the complaint, and that takes time. There's 28 days here, and that's very, very tough on somebody who's being complained about. And confidentiality, which is entirely appropriate, means that clergy don't really know that someone like me, as an archdeacon, is dealing with this all the time, and it's quite normal in one's ministry to have low-level and high-level complaints, often for good reasons, because you're doing a good job and somebody doesn't like it, as well as for other kinds. But as you say, it's not fit for purpose, and it needs to be done differently.
Can I add something, Angela?
Yes, please do.
Just a couple of things. One on the CDM, and I won't. The others have said something about that. I think we just need to be a little bit. There's a lot of stuff in the press at the moment about this. The number of complaints in the Church of England is massively lower than in any other professional body, and that really does need to be seen in context. Which is not to say, by the way, that those who go through it aren't put through an appalling difficulty at times, but we do need some perspective. Where I think the shoe falls on the other foot is that whilst clergy are rightly under a disciplinary framework, there is no real ability for clergy to be protected from those who seek to do them harm, whether they do so intentionally or unintentionally. One of the things I'd like to see us establish much more clearly in our legislative frameworks is an ability to deal with at least those who hold office in the church, who are lay officers, whose behaviour undermines the ministry of clergy, and we have very little recourse at the moment in our structures to deal with that. So I just thought we do need to protect our clergy much more from this. We do have the 2008 Dignity at Work policy, but that's often hidden away in things. But I encourage people to look it up, and if you read it and you think, gosh, this is happening to me, then speak to your area dean or your archdeacon, and that will at least get the matter raised, because people shouldn't be having to carry some of the things they do without realizing that they are being bullied. It's something that we really don't always acknowledge when we see it.
It's one of the things that when I was in the Oxford Diocese that we did I thought, rather good programme, which I inherited for first incumbents, and looking at the way that their roles and self-expectation changed as they went into that particular part of their ministry. And reflecting back on this, I remember when I became a parish priest, that I immediately, at some part of me, psychologically clicked into, oh, the wardens are my line managers, they're the ones to whom I am accountable. And it took me a little time to realise that the questions of leadership and accountability although I knew in the canon law and through observation that wasn't how it worked, my emotions were still tuned to a different way of being, and I really had to unpick what that meant and rediscover expectations. And I think if there's anything at those sort of critical stages of changes of ministry which can actually help people to address the stuff they're carrying with them, which isn't their fault, it's just what they've come with. And it could be from family, it could be from work, it could be from all sorts of things, to do a bit of unpicking in the company of others and to work through that. All those things, I think, help quite a lot. And those are, of course, the therapeutic issues, as the bishop said. I mean, you can't sort of separate out the moral and ethical aspects of ministry from self-care, from resilience, from building sanity in an unsane world in many ways.
Can I mention something?
Please do.
It's just reflecting on all of that, and one thing was just, in a way, some of this conversation addresses a question earlier about systems and how to relate to systems. Well, this is, thinking about CDM and reforming that and different structures, but this is one way of approaching a system and addressing issues with that. You mentioned accountability, and that's something that we're thinking about quite a lot at the moment in terms of the research that we're doing and what we're planning on doing next. And how accountability itself is a really tricky issue because expectations aren't necessarily clear for people. Of the expectations we have of ourselves and that we think other people, though I say we, I'm not actually ordained, I'm imagining myself in the voices of the people in myself. So the expectations we think other people might have of us as well. And on accountability, I know that Methodist Church has done a lot of good work on this and thinking about this and and setting out different sorts of accountability structures and things like the difference between management supervision and pastoral supervision and how those things might work. Where management supervision is about to do with performance and measuring are you kind of enacting your role, and pastoral supervision is more about reflecting on practice and how can we how can I change my practice and improve it. Accountability is a difficult concept because it can be interpreted so differently. It might be about performance management, performance measurement. It might be about discipline. It might be about reflection. It might be about just someone having the space to give their own account of their work. So I think that there are issues there as well around what we mean by accountability and how we approach it.
I think it's extremely difficult when people come into ministry at such different stages of their lives and with such different experiences and with different qualifications that themselves need to be both carried on and transformed. There's a sort of letting go of formations as well as finding new ones, isn't there? I think in a lot of ways. There are questions among us about how from lay people saying, how do we best support the clergy around us? I mean, that would be a different question for those in chaplaincy, those in self-supporting ministry, those in parish ministry. But if you were being asked by lay people in any of those situations, what would you say? What could you do to offer support?
Could I just make a comment on that, which derives from what Simon was saying, a very, very important point about sometimes lay people behaving very, very badly indeed. And we're talking about people working out their agenda, but very badly indeed with clergy. And one of the things I think that lay people maybe can do is to make sure that other laity behave well. The covenant has been beautifully designed, so it involves everyone. But there is a lacuna as far as the accountability of lay people is concerned. The only other thing I'd want to say about accountability is that it is. Of course, we all are accountable. Those of us in ministry are accountable to Christ. Our ministry is not our ministry; it is Christ's ministry, and we are accountable. But I mean, perhaps Liz and I ought to have a conversation about this outside the seminar, but I'm just slightly worried about the so much concentration upon accountability in our time. I mean, I think back to Honora O'Neill's Wreath Lectures, Trust and Transparency, about what she's almost described as trust, transparency, accountability as the modern gods. And she's saying, if this determination to hold everyone accountable were to be successful by its own standards, you'd expect there to be more trust in society than there was before, which she suggested then, over 10 years ago, there isn't.
Can I just jump in on that? And I think John, that one of the interesting things about that is until we get through our safeguarding issues, we are going to have to live with the fact that accountability is going to be high on people's agenda. That faces us. In terms of the wider question, I mean, I've always thought that the greatest gift I have in my parochial ministry, because I'm a parish priest, is the relationship I have with my church wardens. And I've always thought it was something to really invest time in, and to have proper adult relationships with those people. Sometimes that hasn't always worked. I remember in my last parish, I arrived, and within 2 weeks, the wardens came to me and said, when we said change, they said we didn't mean that. I'm just being myself. I haven't realised I changed anything, but I was just being myself. But where it works really well, I think you can be appropriately challenged and appropriately vulnerable with your church wardens, and when that happens, and it happened to me here when I had some serious safeguarding allegations made against me 5 or 6 years ago. Had it not been for the wardens in that time, not just holding the congregation, but actually holding me in prayer, and when the time was appropriate, to then start working with me to rebuild the relationships that inevitably that were damaged through that whole experience, I came to see just what a gift they can be. And I know that's not true everywhere, but if we treat most church wardens with the respect that their office entitles them to, as fellow disciples on the journey, I think we do, we've got a real asset there.
And that's about shared episcopae, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely, John.
Yes, it's very... Sorry, Justine, carry on.
Just on this point, really, about accountability, support, power. One of the things that I've noticed is there are different expectations in different generations of clergy. I don't know if Liz will come across this in her research, but younger clergy or clergy who've come most recently out of the workplace are looking for a line manager and are looking for affirmation. And older clergy, or clergy who've been around much longer, I mean, I've been ordained over 25 years, we're expecting to be office holders, and we're not expecting someone to tell us we're doing a good job all the time, and we're certainly not expecting anyone to line manage us or give us targets. There are different cultures within the church, and the clergy find that difficult to manage, and senior staff find that difficult to manage, because you're working. You can ring somebody up and they're offended and never get back to you, and you can ring somebody else up and they say, "Why haven't you rung me before now?" And you end up like a parish priest with parishioners. It's actually not so very different. So I think I want to go back to kindness and courtesy as really important things, and to recognise the difference between support and affirmation. We often offer support when actually what we need to be offered is around the courtesy and kindness stuff is the thank you and the affirmation. Whoever we are, clergy or lay, needs to be mutual. And in the chat, I've noticed some people are asking about resilience training and pastoral supervision individually or shared or counselling services. These all should be offered by your diocese. They should. I've been teaching them for years. Yes, your diocese will have provision for you to go and see a counsellor, probably completely confidentially. That you should be able to expect resilience training in your training for ministry before and after licensing, ordination, or what have you. And lots of places have shared pastoral supervision or individual pastoral supervision. I've had a pastoral supervisor at various times in my ministry. You know, in the last century, actually, was when I started that off. So but it is very much, as is the case for clergy, you have to sort it and ask for it, and then it can happen. I'm not saying it should be like that, but I'm just saying when you ask, you often find the gatekeepers have got the gate open. They haven't actually got it shut. They're just waiting to be asked.
Yes, and a part of the independence and freedom of the clergy is that it does have to come from them, doesn't it? Because otherwise they'd be all being put through the same stuff, which wouldn't meet their particular needs necessarily. An ongoing issue in the comments is about Sabbath and rest and days off and all the rest of it. And there are very different views and approaches to this, except that it's necessary, that radical unavailability, which Justine spoke about, that she sees in the ministry of Jesus. And I think this is a tricky one, isn't it? You know, one reads, trying just to compare with other people in highly pressured and often very much better paid aspects of life, who live unbelievably long days and unbelievably long hours, but then they are in a different dynamic. And, you know, if we're looking for clergy to be people who can give people time, real time, and not just the, you know, the instant answer, one has to enable them to find that well of refreshment, which makes that time possible. Views on that, Liz? Why don't we start with you? Because I think this is probably something that comes close to your 6 good ideas.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's about boundaries, it's about expectations as well, though. And you were talking about lay people and how people within parishes, within congregations can look after their clergy. And one of those ways is about expectations, and lay people can initiate that as much as clergy can, and can actually ask what can we expect from you, and how can we look after you. And you know, I've heard lots, both, you know, personally and within the research kind of through the clergy, but of lay people just not really understanding that clergy, when, or the hours that they work, and people, you know, the kind of cliches, you only work on a Sunday, don't you? But actually, some people do. That's what they think. They just don't know what clergy do in parishes, and I think that the thing with that for clergy is that if they think that's the case, they have to communicate what they do, but they have to let people know. Otherwise, that they're not going to be able to expect their congregation members, their parishioners, to understand that they work 6 days a week, and they might be working morning, afternoon, and evening, and you know that they might not be available at certain times, and that they just might not understand that. And that's a lot about setting expectations and communicating well, and communicating limits as well, I think.
Yes, and I suspect everyone will do that in different ways, communicating those limits, depending on their circumstances and on their personality type. I just feel it's sad in some ways that lovely combination of, you know, worship, celebration, leisure that Sabbath seems to be about is something that just won't quite fit the Christian pattern of Sundays.
When I was an area dean quite some years ago, we had a new bishop, and he took us away overnight, and he asked us to introduce ourselves and say one thing about us that he'd like us to know. And most people went round the room and saying, oh, this and that and the other about their dog and their children and all that sort of stuff. And he came around to me, and I introduced myself, and I said, the one thing I want you to know about me, Bishop, is that my concert dates go in the diary before anything else.
Yes.
And I've always found that I need to make sure that I put in my diary as blocked out time for my own recreation and nourishing. So if that's any help to anybody, make it a diary entry that I am off.
I think that we do need, don't we? If I may come in, we need to invent for ourselves, because we have this huge freedom. We need to invent for ourselves boundaries. So, for example, a little trick that I have used for years is that I tend to wear a dog collar when I feel I'm on duty, and I take it off when I'm not, and that sends a psychological signal to me that I'm off duty. And there are lots of other ways, I think, aren't there? But if we are feeling that we have to work 24 or minister 24/7, we need to ask ourselves, where is the driver for that coming from? I mean, I think the freedom means as well that I find it helpful. For example, another trick is to diarise, as you're suggesting, Simon, time off. Because if you don't do that, you tend to someone says that you look at the diary and say there's nothing in. But if there is, this is an evening I'm going out, this is an evening I'm doing so and so, this is a day I'm doing so and so, and we can be very diary bound, but we just need to invent little tricks. I do, at any rate, to help myself.
And I don't want to tell tales out of school, but currently nobody's going to concerts or out for a meal. And in talking to clergy, especially those ones who are preparing worship and recording it early, they've been finding this year, what do I do on a Sunday? Or Sundays have suddenly got very, very different, and they've discovered that they can do more Sabbath kind of things on a Sunday, and my hope is that can be claimed and put in other days when Sunday goes more back to normal. But Sabbath time does require restrictions, and if you live in Manchester or North London and you see the way which the Orthodox Jewish community keeps Sabbath, it's quite rigorous, but it creates the space for creativity and for rest and for community.
And I've discovered this wonderful thing, particularly in the early part of the lockdown, which I'd not come across. It's called a weekend. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it involves having 2 days off in a row. It's a really civilized concept, which I'd not heard of before.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad that's been discovered. One thing we haven't really discussed at all, and it hasn't been stated very much overtly in what people have commented on, but it's perhaps there under the surface, is this pandemic has been challenging, not just in terms of our own resilience and well-being, but also in terms of the gospel and of the love of God, and of how we approach death, of how we approach suffering. And I'm wondering if you found anything that in your reading or in your self-reflection which has actually helped you, which you feel when you come out of this you'll have a different view of, or you can offer as help to those of us who struggle with these things.
Strange enough, Angela, I just happen to have a book to hand that has really got me through the last few months. It's called Before the Door of God, an anthology of devotional poetry. And every day I have been reading a poem from, and the most interesting ones have been the ones since 1950. All the modern poets who are really good on the stuff about doubt and darkness. And it's been a real life-giving thing. So that's my top tip. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. And it should be in the Church Times book sale as well.
Good, thank you.
And I must say, for me, poetry has been really important. I have found, I thought I'd do lots of studying and read theological books, but concentration in this pandemic and these lockdowns has just not been easy. And poetry, particularly Mary Oliver, but actually 13th century Rumi, a Sufi mystic, particularly his poem, which is very famous, The Guest House, because he talks about the human person being like a guest house, and in come all these different feelings randomly and welcome them because they are a guest from beyond. They're a message from beyond. And I have found that poem be just very helpful in the dynamics that, you can have 4 seasons in one day emotionally in this pandemic, and poetry has been incredibly helpful, just to be able to recognize that, and hopefully to increase not only my self-awareness but my compassion and wisdom and faith.
It's also about what goes out, though, isn't it? It's also about, you know, what we preach, how we communicate with people who are bereaved or very sick, and you know, it's what gives us stuff that's substantial and helpful and honed into those situations.
I'm sorry to lower the tone, but I've found one of the things that's kept me sane is listening to past episodes of I'm Sorry, I Haven't a Clue.
Very good.
But I mean, I think I've long thought that the real role of the church is to prepare people to die. That's what we're about, it seems to me, more than anything else. And part of that, of course, will be about learning to let go ourselves. And I think that one of the functions of all the things of which we have to let go is to prepare us for that big letting go that we shall all have to undergo. And a part of the wilderness experience of this of this pandemic has been that we have, a lot of us, had to let go of the crutches, the things that have allowed us to be distracted from distraction by distraction, as Eliot would put it. And so I found that, and of course, retreat, it can be a dark experience because one has to search down into the depths. And I mean, I think if we're able to do that ourselves, I mean, I'm a bit sad, really, that we haven't been able to. That this ought to be a time more than any other where we can re-engage our society with the reality of death, but we haven't managed to do that, really. I think there is a reluctance, of course, on lots of people's behalf, but actually helping people through the pain of letting go as we learn to let go ourselves is a really important thing, it would seem to me.
Yes. Anyone else got it? I very much share that view, as you would expect, Bishop. And I do think that sort of coming to terms with death, thinking about death, is something that we ought to do, and we're not very well trained to do. I think in my own training we had a week on sort of death and dying, but it was very much to do with it being out there. You know, this is what they do in hospices, and they'll go through Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Bereavement. All that's terribly helpful, but actually the existential issue for each one of us is, you know, the facing of our maker, of letting go of life, of how we really live each day as 'twere your last, you know. Exactly. I mean, it's a kind of spirituality which we haven't seen around for a very long time.
My late wife Denise talked about when she learned of her terminal condition, it made life not more precious, because that would make it seem as though it's something that needs to be locked in a cupboard, but more delicious. And there's something on the chat saying that the role of the church is to teach people to live. Well, yes, but to live in the light of death, and the Cockfield benefit is, and that includes living through death. No, it doesn't. It includes dying and then rising again with respect. We do not live through death.
Yep. Well, I think that is what a note on which to end, dear friends.
Liz, I wonder what's helped Liz.
Oh, for me, especially the past 6 weeks or so, exercise, definitely. I've been introduced to the world of having complete control over my time, you know, working at home full time, just me, so on my own completely. And I've realised that actually it's important to take control. When you are able to choose how you work and what you do at different times, it's important to take control over that, and not necessarily, for me, stick to 9 till 5, but to exercise at times when that works for me. And exercise has helped with body, mind, soul, spirit, you know, just made a difference to absolutely everything.
Get out of your pajamas and rush to the window singing "The Hills Are Alive." This is what I try to do from time to time.
And I've done more exercise. I've had more exercise. I've done more cycling this last year than I've ever done in my life. But then I came off my bike on black ice before Christmas and broke my femur very badly. So exercise, it does have dangers.
Yes. Okay. Well, everybody, we have run a little beyond our time, and I'm very grateful to everybody who has sent comments and who has taken part in this. I hope you found it really useful. It's been a great privilege to have our 4 speakers with us, and Paul Swann at the beginning. You've all contributed very generously and very thoughtfully and reflectively on this pandemic that we face, and on broader issues of clergy well-being and resilience. So thank you very much to you. Thank you, Church Times, and thank you all of you who have taken part. And we'll now sign off and say goodbye.